To begin our digital blending journey, we must first understand what luminosity masks are. Essentially, luminosity masks are a selection tool. For example, we have the lasso tool, where we can make a quick freehand selection like this, and now we can paint or do any adjustment only in the selected area. Or we can use the more intelligent quick selection tool to make an accurate selection of the sky here above the mountains. Both of these selection tools are very useful, but in digital blending we often need more precise selections. Our images are made up of many different luminosity values. In other words, there's often a huge range of highlights, shadows, and midtones in our photos. Unlike any other selection tool, luminosity masks target only brightness values. They're the most effective way of making accurate selections of highlights, shadows, or midtones. But why is that important? Well, if we look at this image, we can see that the sky is too bright and it lacks color. If we darken the sky, we can fix this and give the image greater mood. One way of doing this is through a simple curves adjustment layer. If we open up a curves layer and place 3 points at the bottom to keep these darker tones unaffected, then we can use this hand to select a bright area on the image and drag down to darken that area. You'll see a new point added to the curve and the sky's darkened. But it clearly doesn't look natural. Let's delete this layer. The other method we can use is through the quick selection tool, as we've already seen. I'll run this across the sky and we have a fairly accurate selection. But if I open up the curves layer and begin to darken the highlights, you'll notice that the mountains start to look extremely out of place. They're too bright. Let's quickly delete this layer. We can change this so that we can include the sky and the mountains in the selection. With a new curves layer, we can once again bring down those highlights. But now we can see 3 problems. Firstly, the mountains in the background are becoming too dark. Secondly, we can see some strange areas which the quick selection tool has missed. And finally, if we zoom in, it's obvious the selection is extremely unclean and certainly not good enough for your imagery. To make a truly accurate selection of the sky and mountains, we only need to use a very basic luminosity mask. So if we go to our channels palette, we'll see 4 thumbnails: RGB, red, green, and blue. Later, when we create our advanced luminosity masks, this is where those masks will be found. But for now, we can actually use any of the red, green, or blue channels as a basic luminosity mask. Without going into too much detail, let me quickly demonstrate to you how luminosity masks can easily make the selections that we're looking for. Firstly, I'm going to choose the channel that has the greatest amount of contrast, which seems to be the red channel. Next, I'm going to hold Control on a PC or Command on a Mac and left click on the red channel thumbnail. You can see the marching ants appear. This is our selection. Now I'll go back to the layers panel and select one of the layers. If you're trying to choose the background layer, it may be locked, in which case double click on that layer to unlock it. Now I press Ctrl and H or Command and H on a Mac and this will hide the marching ants, but the selection will still be active. This time, if I open up the curves layer, you'll see a mask is immediately applied to the curves layer and it looks identical to the red channel, which we based this mask on. To look at your mask, hold down Alt or Option on a Mac and left click on the mask. Click on the layer below to return to the view of the main image. Now if I open the curves layer, you can see by the histogram that none of the darker tones will be included in this adjustment, so our foreground will be protected from the changes. As I bring down the curve, the sky darkens beautifully, and so do the mountains, but they haven't darkened too much like we saw with the quick selection tool earlier. In fact, they've darkened directly in proportion to the sky, so everything looks natural. And if we zoom in, there are no unclean selections on the horizon, and the already dark foreground is protected from the adjustment. So the question is, how do luminosity masks work? Let's move over to a different example now. Here we have 2 layers, a yellow layer on top with the word hello, and a blue layer hidden on the bottom. I'm going to choose the rectangular marquee tool and make a simple selection. Now I'm going to mask out this selection. Just as we saw earlier with the lasso tool and the quick selection tool, we have a strong edge. There isn't a smooth transition between the two layers. If we look at the mask, we can see only black and white. This time, however, I'm going to use the gradient tool instead of a marquee tool. I'll create the mask by running the gradient tool down the image, and you'll see that there is now a smooth transition between the two layers, instead of the harsh transition we saw before. This time, if we look at the mask, we can see a whole range of greys. At the top, we have white, so this area is completely visible. In other words, the yellow layer is visible. At the bottom, we have black, leaving only the blue layer visible. And where we see our grayscale, that is where the smooth transition begins. The lighter the grey, the more visible the area. The darker the grey, the less visible the area. This is where the power of luminosity masks is. Since luminosity masks only make selections based on brightness, we can tailor these selections perfectly to the image we're working on. We don't just work with black and white masks. Our masks are a complex collection of tones that cover the entire monochromatic scale. We can make smooth, natural changes because luminosity masks are created according to each pixel in our image. So let's go back to our mountain and look at the mask we created. We really wanted to darken the sky in some of the mountains. The mask has done that perfectly for us. Since the sky is brighter in the mask, it will experience the strongest effect of the curves layer. And since the mountains are darker than the sky, they'll experience a smaller effect, but they'll still be affected. And that is why the change looks natural. And since the foreground is extremely dark, it's barely affected. Let's take this a step further and brighten our shadows. To reselect our previous mask, we just hover the mouse over the mask of our curves layer, hold down Ctrl or Command on a Mac, and left click. We now have our selection as before. However, since this mask targets mainly the highlights, but we wish to affect only the shadows, we need to invert this selection. We can do that by going to Select and Inverse. Now we can open up another curves layer. This time, the mask looks very different. The darkest areas are now bright and selected in our mask, while the brightest areas are now dark and won't be strongly affected by the adjustment. But if I open the curves layer and raise the shadows, the mountains in the background will be affected slightly. To prevent that, I simply choose the hand and select an area on the mountains. This has created a point along our curve. Now we can raise the curve left of this point to raise the shadows. And again, our changes look smooth and natural. So these two simple curve adjustments have given us a much more balanced image with greater mood and more information in the darker and brighter areas. This is the end of the first luminosity mask tutorial. This is a complex subject which will become clearer as the course moves on, and you'll see more and more examples of luminosity masks at work. In the next video, we'll create more advanced luminosity masks that can target even more precise selections.